I'm starting this video with a warning. I'm going to delve into some pretty esoteric concepts that most of the populace will find detestable, but we'll get into that later. Just be warned, if you're like extremely religious or super dogmatic about empiricism or whatever, maybe you should skip this one. So let's just get into it. Ideas. Where do they come from? You might think, the brain, duh. And you're right, but like what is inside the brain that creates an idea? I'm not talking about neurons or brain regions. That's too literal and not really applicable outside of neuroscience or biology or health concerns. I'm just talking ideas themselves. Ideas are formed partly by experience and partly by taking that experiential knowledge and running simulations with it, with variables changed. So for example, you make a mistake and you spend the next few days thinking about what went wrong and what could have gone different, just going back in time in your head and doing thought experiments. You can also go forward in time doing this as well, which is future prediction, something other animals can't do. There are a few ways artists use this kind of thought activity to use in their artistic pursuits. For instance, I was at a party talking to this person and they told me, I really like art. I used to be good at it, but now I'm not. So I asked them, what happened? They said, I was going through a breakup and I was really sad. So then I suggested, maybe you were pouring your emotions into your art. And now that you're over it, there's nothing to pull from. And they thought about it for a moment and said, yeah, maybe. Another way people make art is by capturing the moment. It's really popular these days since everybody has a phone in their pocket. So everyone can be a photographer now. This includes video as well. But what did we do before? We took portraits and had to hold still for hours so artists could capture our likeness. Or we did landscape paintings to preserve things as we saw it in that moment in time. So now we have two ways of fueling our creation, the conceptual and the concrete. Art that represents the stuff in our head like our emotions or personal experiences, and art that is representative of things we see with our eyeballs. The way you choose to express these things is usually influenced by other artists you've seen. So Van Gogh was influenced by Monet, Pissarro, and the Impressionist movement, after which Expressionism was influenced by Van Gogh's innovations among other artists from his generation. When you don't take inspiration from predecessors or movements, or lack a solid grasp on the fundamentals of the medium you're working in, you are considered an outsider artist. Outsider artists are cool because it's the artistic equivalent of coming across an uncontacted tribe. There's a lot to learn from people who've basically built their artistic outlook from the ground up. So we've talked about style affinity and we've talked about subjective experiences, but there's a secret third thing that you can also be influenced by, and this is the weird thing I was talking about at the start of the video. Some of the greatest artists and the greatest works of art can sometimes seem to come from nowhere. There are times where an artist will create a work of art that can be considered a masterpiece, and they'll say in interviews or writings that it seemed like something else was working through them. A good example is Bob Dylan saying he used to have a thing that allowed him to write his songs, but as he got older he lost it, and he still doesn't know what was possessing him when he wrote his biggest hits in the 60s. One of my favorite songs by Blink-182 was written in 5 minutes, and there are other examples of great songs being written in a similar time frame, or a band will crank out an entire album in one studio session. Jackson Pollock was a renowned abstract painter known for his work using paint spatter to create visual depth and elicit emotions from people who viewed them in person. When he demonstrated his process, it seemed like he would enter a trance, and he would move with a spontaneous flow and creative energy similar to that of a jazz drummer deep in the pocket. Before I go further, I'm sure everybody by this point is familiar with the concept of the flow state. It became really popular in the mid to late 2010s, and not to brag, but I was one of the first people who was paying attention to that idea and the research being conducted about it right before it hit the mainstream consciousness. What grabbed my attention was the description of the flow state being like an effortless doing where every action is perfect and it feels like you are being pushed along by some untapped energy. This lined up with my experience hitting flow states when I used to do acid right after high school. Later on, I found out that billionaire CEOs in Silicon Valley started doing psychedelics as well to reach these flow states. But here's the thing that interested me the most. I also knew that having a deep psychedelic experience creates similar brainwave patterns in the brain as people claiming to go through a religious experience. So what's going on here? What am I trying to get at with this line of thinking? At the risk of sounding crazy, I believe that there's this thing called the collective unconscious, which was discovered and put forward by a prominent psychologist named Carl Jung. And I think people can tap into it through meditation, through psychedelics, or just suddenly, like one would have a religious experience. This puts you in what's called the flow state, where this realm underlying our reality takes hold of you and brings forth things into this reality through your creative process. The works created this way are so resonant with other people because it's drawn from a place that is universal and all-pervading. So you might ask, why do I think there's a realm underlying our reality? It's really because of things like astral projection, ghosts, and psychic phenomena. And I totally get that the last two sound like total BS, but if you ever had the experience of leaving your body, you will get the intuitive feeling that the world we live in is deeper than just physical matter. People who are very experienced in astral travel or meditation tell us that this world is an illusion. That doesn't mean fake or anything like that, just that it's a subset of some larger system, and this dense reality we live in isn't all there is. So when you dream or enter a flow state, you are connecting to that higher sphere. When you get a feeling about something and can't explain why, you are using extrasensory perception. It's extrasensory because it is outside the scope of the five senses, which take in data through the physical world. Some people call this other place heaven, the astral, the hereafter, God, or the collective unconscious. But once your consciousness establishes contact with it, your ideas become very powerful. I'm sure I'm sounding schizophrenic or silly right now, but you don't have to believe this. I'm not trying to change anyone's spiritual beliefs. I just think finding ways to do things like astral project or meditate very deeply can open up a really big well to draw from when it comes to the creative process. It also makes you more empathetic, in my opinion, because through heightened awareness, you can start to care for every other living thing as if it were your friends or family, as you then realize we all spring forth from the same source. Not that you need to do this to have empathy, of course. It's just that at that point, the awareness of others' feelings become all-encompassing for you and even a little overwhelming. And I think that's where a lot of great art comes from. Selfishness disappearing, not trying to become a great artist or anything egotistical, just trying to use your skill to relay important messages to others in order to enrich their lives or show them that they are not alone in the feelings that they feel. I'll talk more about this in future videos, or if you're a binger from the future, you've probably watched them already. Either way, thanks for tuning in.